I still remember the sound of my heels against the marble floor that morning. Slow, heavy, uncertain. Every step toward the bridal suite felt like I was walking deeper into a dream I had spent my entire life begging for. But not because of the flowers, not because of the dress, and definitely not because of the wedding. No, I wanted one thing, just one. For my father to finally look at me like I mattered. The entire hotel smelled like roses and expensive perfume. Bridesmaids rushed around me laughing softly. Makeup artists sipped in and out of the room. And somewhere downstairs, a piano played the same soft melody over and over again. Everyone kept saying the same thing. You must be so excited. You look beautiful. Your father is going to cry when he sees you. And every single time someone mentioned him, my chest tightened. Because deep down, I wasn't sure he was even coming. I stood in front of the mirror staring at myself in silence. White satin, pearl earrings, hands trembling so badly I could barely hold my bouquet. I looked exactly like the daughters in those perfect wedding movies my mother used to watch when I was little. But my life had never looked like that. Not once. My father, Richard Hale, loved appearances more than people, especially me. To the world, he was respected, successful, elegant, the kind of man who donated to charities and shook hands with politicians while cameras flashed around him. But inside our home, he was cold. Not angry, not loud, just cold. And somehow that hurt more. Because at least anger feels like emotion. Coldness feels like absence. I spent my childhood chasing tiny moments from him like they were oxygen. A smile, a hug, how was your day? But my father treated affection like something expensive he couldn't afford to waste on me, especially after my mother died. I was 12 the day we buried her, and I remember standing beside him at the cemetery, my tiny fingers wrapped around his hand so tightly because I thought we only had each other left. But he slowly pulled his hand away, like even grief wasn't enough to connect us. After that day, he changed completely. Or maybe he had always been that way, and my mother had simply hidden it from me. He buried himself in work, meetings, trips, business dinners. And I buried myself in silence. Years passed inside that enormous house where nobody really spoke unless it was necessary. The staff knew more about me than my own father did. They remembered my birthday. He forgot it 3 years in a row. I made excuses for him anyway. He's stressed. He's grieving. He just doesn't know how to show love. But eventually, excuses become emotional prisons. And you don't realize you're trapped until one moment finally breaks you. Mine happened when I was 16. I had won a national writing competition at school. It was the first thing I had ever truly achieved on my own. I remember holding the letter in my shaking hands, reading my name over and over again. Because for once, I felt seen. The ceremony was held downtown. Parents filled the auditorium. Mothers fixing ties. Fathers taking photos. I kept checking the doors every few seconds, waiting for him. He promised he would come. I'll be there, he said the night before without even looking up from his laptop. And stupidly, I believed him. My name was called. The audience applauded. I walked across the stage alone. And when I looked into the crowd, his seat was empty. Empty. That single image stayed with me for years. Because sometimes heartbreak doesn't happen loudly. Sometimes it's just an empty chair in a crowded room. Later that night, he came home after midnight. No apology. No explanation. He loosened his tie while walking through the kitchen and casually asked, "How did your little school thing go?" Your little school thing. I stood there staring at him while something inside me quietly collapsed. That was the first night I cried without making a sound. And after that, I stopped expecting things from him. Or at least I tried to. Until Daniel came into my life. Daniel wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. He didn't belong in my father's world. Which was probably why I loved him. He listened when I spoke. He remembered details. He noticed when I was pretending to be okay. The first time he met my father was during dinner at our house, and I already knew it would go badly. My father spent the entire evening questioning him like a business rival instead of a human being. What exactly are your long-term ambitions? How much do you make? What can you realistically provide for my daughter? Daniel stayed calm the entire time, but I saw the humiliation in his eyes. And afterward, sitting inside his car, he looked at me quietly and asked, "Does he always make you feel like people need to earn the right to love you?" That question shattered me more than anything my father had ever done, because I didn't know how to answer it. Years later, when Daniel proposed to me near the lake where we had our first date, I cried before he even opened the ring box. Not because I was surprised, but because for the first time in my life, someone chose me gently. And maybe that sounds small, but when you grow up emotionally abandoned, gentleness feels like magic. The wedding planning should have been happy. Instead, it became another battlefield. My father criticized everything. The venue was too emotional. The flowers were unnecessary. Daniel was still not enough. But I tolerated it, because some broken part of me still wanted one perfect moment with him, one memory that didn't hurt. Which is why I asked him anyway. 3 months before the wedding, I stood in his office doorway while rain tapped softly against the windows. He barely looked up from his paperwork. "Yes?" I swallowed hard. "I was wondering if..." My voice almost disappeared. "If you would walk me down the aisle." Silence. He leaned back slowly in his chair, and for one tiny second, I thought maybe he would smile. Maybe he would finally soften. Maybe this would be the moment everything changed. But instead, he sighed. Actually sighed, like I had inconvenienced him. "Millie," he said carefully, "don't make this more emotional than it needs to be." I felt my stomach drop. "I'm your daughter, and I'm paying for the wedding. Isn't that enough?" Enough. That word destroyed something in me forever, because love should never feel transactional. I stood there frozen while humiliation crawled through my chest. Then came the sentence I will never forget. "I don't think walking you down the aisle would be appropriate." Appropriate. As if I was some distant obligation instead of his child. I remember leaving his office unable to breathe properly. And for the first time in my life, I stopped crying over him. Because grief changes when disappointment becomes permanent. But what I didn't know that day was that someone else had already decided I would never walk alone again. The next morning, I woke up feeling hollow. Not angry, not even surprised anymore, just tired. There's a special kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone who keeps proving they don't know how to love you back, and I had carried that exhaustion my entire life. Daniel noticed immediately. He always did. We were sitting in our tiny apartment kitchen, sunlight spilling softly across the counter while coffee brewed between us. "You talked to him, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "And?" I stared down at my untouched coffee cup. He said no. Daniel's jaw tightened, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for me to notice he was trying very hard to control his emotions. Then he reached across the table and held my hand. "I'm sorry." 3 simple words, but somehow they healed more than all the speeches my father had failed to give me over the years, because empathy matters. Being seen matters. And Daniel saw me completely. That should have been enough. But grief has layers, and no matter how much love Daniel gave me, there was still a little girl inside me wondering why her own father never chose her. The wedding got closer, and things became worse. My father barely participated unless appearances were involved. He cared about the guest list, the press, the seating arrangement for business associates, but not me. Never me. One afternoon during a family brunch, he casually announced that several important clients would be attending. Then he looked directly at me and said, "Try not to turn the ceremony into one of your emotional scenes." Everyone went silent. Even my aunt lowered her eyes awkwardly, and I just sat there smiling politely, because humiliation had become second nature to me. But inside, I was collapsing. That night, I locked myself in the bathroom and cried so hard I nearly became sick. Not because of what he said, but because a tiny part of me still hoped he would stop saying things like that someday. Trauma makes hope dangerous, and yet we keep hoping anyway. Until everything changed 2 weeks before the wedding. I was visiting my grandmother Eleanor. Technically, she wasn't my biological grandmother. She had been my mother's stepmother. But she loved me more genuinely than most blood relatives ever had. Her house always smelled like vanilla tea and old books. Safe, warm, nothing like my father's cold mansion. We sat together on the porch while rain rolled gently across the garden, and suddenly she asked, "Has your father apologized yet?" I laughed softly. "No." She nodded slowly, like she already expected that answer. Then she reached for my hand. "You know," she whispered, "your mother used to cry about the way he treated you." I froze. "What?" Eleanor's eyes filled with sadness. "She tried so hard to protect you from his emotional distance." My chest tightened painfully. "No one ever told me that." "Because your mother didn't want you growing up believing you weren't lovable." That sentence broke me. Completely. I stared out at the rain while memories flooded back all at once. The empty school seat, forgotten birthdays, cold conversations, dismissive looks. And suddenly I realized something devastating. My father didn't fail to love me because I was difficult to love. He failed because he never learned how. That realization changed everything. Because for the first time, I stopped blaming myself. And healing often begins there. But life wasn't finished surprising me yet. 3 days before the wedding, I received a phone call that nearly destroyed me. It was my father's assistant. "Miss Hale," she said nervously, "I thought you should know. Your father may not attend the ceremony." My entire body went numb. "What?" "He has a business meeting in Singapore that overlaps with the wedding schedule." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because heartbreak eventually becomes absurd. He's choosing a meeting over his daughter's wedding? "I'm sorry." I ended the call and just sat there in silence. Daniel found me 30 minutes later, still staring at the wall. "What happened?" I couldn't even answer properly. "He might not come." Daniel immediately understood who I meant. His face darkened. "That's it," he said quietly. But there was something different in his voice this time. Not anger. Decision. The next day, something I never expected. There was a knock at our apartment door, and standing outside was my father's younger brother, my Uncle Thomas. I hadn't seen him in years. Not because of me, because my father hated him. Thomas was everything Richard wasn't. Warm, messy, human. He hugged me the second he saw me, and honestly, I nearly cried from that alone. "I heard what happened," he said gently. I stepped aside to let him in. Daniel offered coffee while the three of us sat awkwardly around the table. Finally, Thomas looked directly at me and said, "Your father has spent his entire life confusing control with strength." I stayed silent. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old photograph. It was my mother, young, laughing, holding me as a baby. "She loved you more than anything," he whispered. My throat tightened instantly. "She used to tell me you deserved softness." I broke down crying right there at the kitchen table. Years of pain, loneliness, emotional starvation. Everything finally surfaced at once. And Thomas simply sat beside me quietly while I cried. No judgment, no discomfort, just presence. Sometimes healing starts the moment someone stays instead of leaving. Then he said something that changed my life forever. "If your father doesn't show up," he paused carefully, "I would be honored to walk you down the aisle." I couldn't breathe for a second, because suddenly, for the first time in my entire life, I felt chosen by family. Not tolerated, not managed, chosen. And somehow that mattered more than I can explain. The wedding day arrived beneath gray skies and soft rain, ironically beautiful, like the universe understood emotional stories better than people did. The bridal suite buzzed with nervous energy while makeup artist adjusted final details. But I felt strangely calm, not happy, not yet, but peaceful in a way I hadn't expected, because something inside me had shifted. I no longer needed my father's approval to feel worthy, and that realization was freeing. Still, when the ceremony music began downstairs, my hands trembled violently. Old wounds don't disappear overnight. One of my bridesmaids squeezed my shoulder gently. "You ready?" I nodded slowly. Then the door opened, and my heart stopped, because my father was standing there. For one impossible second, hope returned. Dangerous, familiar, painful. He wore his expensive black suit and carried the same emotionally unreadable expression he always had. "I came," he said simply. No apology, no warmth, just those two words. I stared at him silently, then finally whispered, "Why?" He looked uncomfortable, actually uncomfortable, as though emotions were languages he never learned fluently. "Because appearances matter." There it was, the truth, always the truth. And strangely, it didn't hurt anymore, because by then, I already understood something important. People reveal themselves repeatedly, We just keep hoping for different endings. Then he glanced toward the hallway. So, are we doing this? My stomach twisted. Years ago, I would have accepted immediately, desperately, gratefully. But healing changes your standards. And suddenly, I realized I didn't want to walk beside someone who saw me as an obligation. I wanted to walk beside love, real love, even if it came from unexpected places. So I looked directly at him and quietly said, "No." He blinked. "What?" "I'm not asking you anymore." For the first time in my life, my father looked shaken, truly shaken. Then another voice spoke softly behind him. "I'll take it from here." Uncle Thomas stepped forward, and the second I saw him, tears filled my eyes. Because unlike my father, Thomas looked at me like I mattered, like I was precious, like walking beside me was an honor instead of a burden. My father's face hardened instantly. This is ridiculous. But Thomas didn't even argue. He simply held out his arm toward me and softly asked, "Ready, kiddo?" Kiddo. That tiny affectionate word nearly shattered me. I slipped my arm through his, and in that moment, something healed inside me forever. The church doors opened slowly. Music echoed softly through the hall, and suddenly everyone stood. Hundreds of faces turned toward me, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't searching for my father's approval in the crowd. I wasn't shrinking myself to earn love, steady and warm, like he understood the weight of that moment. Halfway down the aisle, I glanced up at him and quietly whispered, "Thank you." He smiled softly. "No, sweetheart, thank you." That word again, sweetheart. Such a simple thing, yet somehow more fatherly than anything Richard Hale had ever given me. I noticed people crying quietly in the audience. Even Daniel looked emotional, standing at the altar. But then I saw my father, alone near the back row, watching silently. And for the first time ever, he looked small, not powerful, not intimidating, just lonely. Because the truth about emotionally cold people is this: eventually, their distance isolates them from the very people they wanted control over. And sometimes, that becomes their punishment. The ceremony was beautiful, not because everything was perfect, but because I finally stopped grieving the fantasy of who my father could have been. And acceptance is powerful. When Daniel held my hands during the vows, his voice cracked slightly. "You spent your whole life trying to earn love," he whispered. Tears streamed down my face instantly. "But you never needed to earn mine." That sentence healed wounds I had carried since childhood. Because love should never feel conditional. Not from parents, not from partners, not from anyone. After the ceremony, guests filled the ballroom with laughter and music. For once, I actually felt light, free, alive. Then came the moment I never expected. My father approached me quietly near the terrace doors. People around us slowly drifted away, sensing the tension. He stood there awkwardly for several seconds before speaking. "You embarrassed me today." I stared at him in disbelief. Even now, even after everything, that was his concern. Embarrassment, appearances, control. But instead of shrinking, I smiled sadly. "No," I said softly. "You embarrassed yourself." Silence. The rain tapped gently against the glass behind us, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of him. Then I added something I had needed to say for years. "You taught me what emotional absence feels like, but other people taught me what love feels like." His expression cracked slightly, just slightly, but enough. And suddenly I realized something devastating. My father wasn't emotionless. He was emotionally lost. There's a difference. Some people spend so long protecting themselves from vulnerability that they eventually lose access to love completely. And maybe that was his tragedy, but it no longer had to become mine. He looked down briefly before asking, "Do you hate me?" I thought about it carefully. All the birthdays, all the empty seats, all the coldness. Then I shook my head. No, because hate requires emotional energy, and honestly, I was finally at peace. I just stopped waiting for you. That sentence seemed to hit him harder than anger ever could. He nodded once, slowly. Then, without another word, he walked away. And strangely, I didn't stop him. Because closure doesn't always arrive through apologies. Sometimes closure is simply realizing you survived without the love you once begged for. Later that evening, Uncle Thomas found me outside beneath the terrace lights. "You okay?" he asked gently. I smiled. "Yeah." And for the first time, I truly meant it. He looked emotional for a second before saying, "Your mother would have been proud of you today." That nearly made me cry again. But these tears felt different. Not broken, not abandoned, just human. Years later, people still ask me about my wedding. And surprisingly, I rarely talk about the dress, the flowers, the venue. I talk about the moment I realized family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes family is simply the people who stay, the people who choose softness, the people who walk beside you when others refuse to. My father and I speak occasionally now. Short conversations, careful distance. But something changed after that wedding. Not in him, in me. I stopped chasing love that hurt, and that decision transformed my entire life. Because healing begins the moment you understand this. You are not difficult to love simply because someone failed to love you correctly. Sometimes the people who break us are broken too, but their brokenness is not our responsibility to carry forever. And sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building a beautiful life without the people who once made you feel invisible. So if you're listening to this while grieving someone who never chose you properly, please hear me carefully. Their inability to love deeply does not reduce your worth. You are still worthy of softness, still worthy of loyalty, still worthy of being chosen fully. And one day, someone better will walk beside you too. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been betrayed by those closest to you, know that you are stronger than the pain. Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And remember, keep blooming. If you like my story, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it. Something healed inside me forever.